Hi, I'm Dr. Teresa Schulman. I'm a clinical psychologist and I specialize in treating depression. Over the years that I've been working with depression, I've come to understand that depression is not one thing. When I say this, what I mean is depression is a collection of symptoms that tell us that something is wrong. But knowing that somebody's depressed or has clinical depression doesn't tell us anything really about what the underlying causes are. So I've organized these underlying causes into 5 different types. And I'm going to go over in brief what those 5 types are and why that's so important. And then I'll, in subsequent videos, go into depth about each one and then talk about the treatments for them. So the reason why I feel like it's really important to think about depression as not one thing is because when people get diagnosed with clinical depression, and that could be any kind of clinical depression, whether it's a dysthymia, major depressive disorder, even an adjustment disorder with depression. So it doesn't really matter what the DSM diagnosis is, so much as that the idea is that they have a depressive episode or that they are, experiencing the signs and symptoms of depression. And there's already plenty of videos and books about what depression is in terms of those definitions, and you can look and see what are the different things that you have to check off in order to be considered depressed. And you might have a couple of those, or you might have all of those. So you might meet full criteria for depression, or you might just feel really depressed but not meet full criteria. But what I'm really focused on is what are the underlying issues that are causing your system to show up as depressed, because that is what I find really makes the difference of whether people get the treatment that they need and then really get well. I've seen so many times where people have been depressed, have gone to therapy, have taken medication, and are still not doing better. They're still not feeling better. They're not feeling fully alive and fully engaged in life. And it can be really demoralizing. It can be really disheartening when people feel like I did what I was told to do and I'm still not getting better. And if people have tried multiple types of medication and they haven't responded well to them, they're often labeled as having treatment-resistant depression. And then the treatments that are recommended are often escalated to more intensive type treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, or some kind of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I'm not actually commenting on whether those work or not, but they don't necessarily resolve the underlying issue of why the person is depressed in the first place, just as oftentimes medication doesn't resolve the underlying issue of why the person is depressed in the first place, even though it may help the symptoms to go down. Let's dive into what these 5 types of depression are and how that can really help us get to the right kinds of treatment. And then again, in further videos, I'll go into more specifics about each of the types of depression. So the first type I call logjam depression. And logjam depression is a depression where you have repressed or cut off from yourself any emotion or identity or core aspect of yourself, and it's been sent away from your experience or from your consciousness. So in psychodynamic therapy, this might be called repression. And in other therapies that we talk about how people are in their defenses, but they're not really able to feel whatever the emotion is that feels like it's too threatening or wouldn't be safe to feel or wouldn't be accepted, or if there's some part of themselves that wouldn't be accepted. And so that gets stopped up, and over time, that can cause depression, and that's what I call logjam depression. The second one is what I call existential depression, and that is where there's a crisis of meaning or purpose, where what you've known about yourself, your identity, no longer feels like it's serving you, no longer feels like it makes sense. Maybe you don't really feel like you know what the point is. Maybe you don't really feel like you know what your purpose is. That is an existential issue, and it can cause a real and serious depression. But that kind of depression doesn't usually get much better from medication, although people can function better possibly with medication. But the underlying issues are existential ones, and need a specific treatment for that. The third type of depression I call nervous system shutdown depression or trauma-triggered shutdown depression. And this is the kind of depression where your nervous system has gone from a fight or flight, like sympathetic stress response of high stress. And oftentimes it goes into, if you can't fight and you can't run, right, flee, and you can't fix it, you go into a shutdown response. So your nervous system is determining that you're more likely to survive if you shut down than if you try to fight or flee, or your nervous system is determining that those things are impossible. And so your nervous system shuts you down, and that can look like depression. But it's actually caused by trauma. And so trauma therapy is needed. The fourth type of depression is what I call attachment wound depression. And that is where, based on your early attachment relationships, you take in beliefs about yourself that leave you with a belief and a sense and a feeling of shame, unworthiness, inadequacy. And those beliefs are really underlying the depression. And those can be very deeply entrenched. They can be totally out of your awareness, but they play out in your current relationships, or they play out in your current behaviors in terms of seeking to drink or do things to excess in order to drown out the feelings that come from those core beliefs. So that's called attachment wound depression. And the fifth type is an entire category of depressions that I jokingly call egg depressions. And that's just because when I eat eggs, I feel depressed, like seriously depressed. But that's any type of what I call non-meaning based depression. So the first four categories of depression have to do with the meaning that we make of our experiences. It's not the experiences themselves, right? Like, people can go through a really traumatic event, and if they have help and they don't feel alone and they feel supported and seen and validated, they usually won't end up depressed even though they went through this traumatic event. If they feel loved and accepted and part of a community, and they have help getting through it, and they're physically allowed to discharge whatever stress built up in their body, they won't get depressed. So what causes the depression is based on the meaning that we make from being alone, not having help, not being able to work that through our body, etc., or not allowing ourselves to feel what we feel. So those are all meaning-based types of depression, those first four. But the last one, the fifth type, are all the depressions that are based really on our physiology. And a lot of times people think that's the only type of depression there is, that any clinical depression is based solely on physiology. And that just isn't true. There is so much unconscious process and meaning and learning that happens that causes depression. But there is also depression that is based pretty purely on physiology. That could be based on food sensitivities. That could be based on inadequate nutrients. That could be based on inadequate sunlight, inadequate sleep, inadequate social interaction, like being alone too long and isolated and not having social interactions. But those are not meaning-based. Those are based in your physiology. And so those are what I call egg depressions. There's a whole burgeoning field of psychiatry called metabolic psychiatry that is just exploding right now with new research and new writing, and people are learning that ketogenic diets as therapy can be tremendously helpful in terms of giving the brain energy when there's metabolic deficiencies. And that is really based on treating what I would call egg depressions that are non-meaning based, but are based in our physiology. So I just find it helpful to think about these 5 types of depression, and that way people can really get the kinds of treatment that they need so that they can really get well. Because if you've been depressed and you think that you've tried therapy and you've tried medication, and so there's nothing more for you to do other than just accept yourself as somebody who is a depressed person, I want to encourage you to have hope and to try to seek out the kind of therapy that does a good job of treating your distinct type or types of depression.